regular traveler or tourist that doesn't have as much time, right? What are some tips that they can practice or some thoughts that they can have in order to keep the itinerary as flexible as possible so they can still take advantage of, like, cheaper prices somewhere and things like this? Because for example, although I travel long term, but sometimes in certain places I like to move around quickly, like Western Europe, for example. Like, there's no point spending like a month in Paris or something because that's super expensive, right? So those I tend to move around quicker, and sometimes I book stuff like extremely last minute. Like, I will book the accommodation for the day only on that day in the morning. I'll find the accommodation for the night only in the day, and that's the time when you get like a lot of discounts suddenly popping up because they're trying to sell off the accommodation for the night. So what are some ways that regular travelers can, try and take these into account to cut costs while traveling?
Well, I think that's smart in a lot of ways, because also if you book too far ahead and something goes wrong, your flight doesn't make it or your bus doesn't make it or whatever, and if it's a non-refundable night at the hotel, you've just paid for something you're not using. Like in the old days, we would just show up in town, like pre-internet. You just showed up and started looking around, and that could still work if you want to do it. But you can also call hotels directly and try to, especially for staying for a few days, try to get a better rate, because then they don't have to pay booking.com or Expedia or Agoda or whatever. But anyway, I mean, there's this creativity writer that used to be popular. His name's Roger Van Oaks, and he had this saying that was, always look for the second right answer, because usually, when your first one doesn't work out, there's a better answer. You just have to keep looking. And I think you brought up the example where you could fly from Singapore to Berlin, so maybe you had no desire to go to Berlin. You really wanted to go to France or Italy, but take that flight and then get a train or get a bus or something, and I always tell people to look at alternate airports, especially for Europe, because things are pretty close together there, so maybe a flight to Sofia, for example, is really expensive, but you can get one to Istanbul for super cheap, well, then just take a train up from Turkey, it's not a big deal. And I think that's true in a whole lot of markets. And also flexibility on dates is super important. Maybe, if you come 2 days earlier or stay 2 days later, you'll get a much better rate. And, same with hotels. If you're going to arrive right in the middle of when a festival's going on, you're probably not going to be happy with your price of, lodging. But if you can come 2 or 3 days later, it'll be a different story. And so I would just always tell people to not be wedded to, the exact plan you have in your head, because if you can change it a little bit, you'll probably be much better off. And I think that's more of an issue with vacationers than it is with people like us, because they haven't traveled much and they don't know instinctively to start looking for other answers. But I think for us, it's kind of built into our nature that if we see a price that's really high, we go, okay, what can I do to change this?
Right. And the other thing about, I think that might not be a very common knowledge among people who, let's say, don't travel as often, is that there are certain hubs or airport hubs in specific continents that are really great to fly from, where it's always the cheapest. And I'll say it's not as much as the distance travel versus the connectivity of an airport hub. So for example, if you look at South America, the hubs to fly in and fly out of are generally like Sao Paulo in Brazil or Lima in Peru. So those are hubs whereby flights come in and usually at cheaper prices. Even Bogota or I think Medellin in Colombia are also good hubs to fly in from or fly out of to Europe. And that applies to every single continent. I would say there will be specific cities whereby flights are cheaper, and you want to try and search within the city. Like in Europe, it'll be Frankfurt, Istanbul. Those are bigger hubs. And as you start playing around more with the, let's say, the Google Flights map, you start to realize, oh, okay, now I need to plan according to this. And if you can get that right, I think you can start saving a lot of cost, because you can base off your flight prices and your travel plans off of a transit hub.
Yeah, I think that Google Flights map is a beautiful thing. It's so helpful because you basically can put in your starting point or your end point and leave everything else blank, and it will tell you where all the deals are. And just, the hubs example you brought up, like if you wanted to fly from South America to Europe and you checked, let's say from Santiago, you might find terrible deals, but if you check from Sao Paulo, you might find a flight to Portugal for $300, so it would make sense for you to end up in Brazil instead of in Chile when you're doing your South America trip before you move on. So yeah, I think it's really important. And I mean, I'm still amazed all the time when I look at that map, how much of a difference there is even between cities that are right next to each other. It can be double the price to go from one place than to the other. And sometimes they're only 3 or 4 hours apart by car, or by train. So you won't know that until you start looking.